Hey guys, Thomas Jr. here, aka Mustached Tom, and I'm here to review the movie Morbious. If you end up enjoying this review, then please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Also make sure to check out those links in the description. One will head over to my Discord, second to my Patreon, third to my PayPal. Any donations are greatly appreciated. It helps support me and the channel, and shilling will be reminded at the end of the review. With that out of the way, let's get into Morbious. So I had actually heard that this movie was going to exist quite a bit ago. I think I saw the trailer once, except it did look a little bit different from what I can remember it being. I honestly was a little bit excited for this movie, believe it or not, because out of all the characters from all the superheroes and supervillains and all that stuff from Marvel to DC, I'm always excited to see what happens if you take a character that hasn't really gotten that much attention. It's funny that people were just getting mad about the new Joker, and I had to say new 3 times just to know what I'm referring to is in the version of the Batman, not Phoenix or the other new Joker. To avoid all that confusion. I think it would. I'm actually on that boat as well, where I'm like, yeah, you know what? I'm a little bit tired of Joker 2, so let's see what happens if we actually get a little bit of a new, villain or anti-hero, in this case of Morbius. So, believe it or not, I think I hyped myself up a little bit too much, though. However, I will give this movie some credit as well. I'm here to be as objective as possible, by the way. And again, all the stuff will happen at the end of the shilling and all that good stuff. But, so yes, this is Morbius. I will say that the main movie's issue is twofold, is that the pacing, and I did hear this in another review, and I do agree with it. Angry Joe is the first one I came across. I do agree that the pacing is too fast. I believe for the movie type that this is going for, that this could have definitely succeeded if it took a little bit more time in developing certain aspects of what it was going for. In terms of that, I agree. In terms of the other part, in terms of being quote-unquote sort of like a vampire movie, I feel like it almost succeeds. Almost. But not quite. It's missing a little bit here. And we're going to get to all of that. So. Oh, hold on. Just give me a second. I have to actually... Sorry, I just recorded a previous review, so I have to actually switch over my notes to my Morbius review, so I'm not getting all confused and whatnot. So the movie starts in Costa Rica, so at some point in the distant present, where we see Michael Morbius, played by Jared Leto, who was one of the Jokers, ironically enough, that I brought that up earlier. And he cuts his hand, and these bats start flying out, and everything's, why he's doing this in this timeline seems a little bit confusing. But then we suddenly cut 20 years before, when he was a kid. Now, honestly, based on that first scene, I honestly think that this first scene could have been cut from the movie entirely. The first little segment of him doing that doesn't add anything except where those bats come from later in the movie. And I feel like they don't really, even in that aspect, they don't feel like they add significance to the movie, except for the very end. But even then, I feel like you didn't need that beginning scene. I feel like they could have completely cut that part out and start from the childhood aspect and increase the amount of time we are here in this sort of flashback of them as youths. As we see him and this other young boy who are both missing a part of themselves. Morbius has issues with walking, and I'm actually not sure what the other kid struggles with. I just wrote that what he said, that they were both missing a part of them, the two of the kids in this room. The other kid is Louisine, or as he's called later in the movie, Milo. So the movie almost, weirdly, when it's on these two kids, it almost makes it seem like this Lucian, or however you pronounce his name, is going to be the main character. But then the movie says, like, no, it's actually referring to the other boy, the Morbius. As we learn, he is the young Morbius is the other one. And in fact, he fixes the device that is like that helps Louisine, or Milo. I'll just call him Milo for simplicity. Helps him to survive, and he's given like this like opportunity to go to a better school. So he's given this little note, and these four generic bully characters sort of attack him. And then it instantly cuts to some time in the future again. And again, I feel like I just talked about that for like 3 minutes, and it felt like that scene was definitely, like those scenes were definitely too short to sort of absorb some of the information we were provided with later on in the movie. So we'll see that Morbius, I'll just call him by his last name since that's the given title name, is given him an award, and he's moved with this other scientist. I just called her Dr. Bancroft, I think her name is. I just called her Lady Doctor for as, you know, she's sort of, yeah, the character work in this isn't great, being blunt. So, she shows him these bats that he collected, again, in the beginning, and, I guess, like, the beginning part came before this, but after the childhood thing. So again, the ordering of this movie's, if not the pacing, then the ordering is too bizarre. Like, why would they cut back and then cut forward again to have the spliced part of the beginning be something that's like to explain something that's happening now? I don't know, it just feels a little bit of an oddity to record it, to set the stage up like that that quickly, and of all things. Anyways, so he wants to make a cure for his condition. So he has a good cause in mind. So he injects the rat first with the bat DNA, and these specific bats drain human blood. But the rat dies, so they think that they failed. He proceeds to help this little girl that's with them, the two of them. She's just in their care. However, when they look back, the rat is back to life. And so both of them actually seem pretty upbeat about that whole scenario. And so, after she leaves, we cut to Morbius talking with a much older now Milo. Very, very briefly. They go like for a brief walk together. Morbius checks the DNA of like something or other, and he injects himself with the help of her, with Dr. Bancroft. And one of the crew, for whatever reason, starts to head back towards their little facility. And he begins to attack from the roof. And I will say, from this point onward, it is shot a lot more like a horror movie, which, again, I'm not going to say it's perfect or even good. However, I am going to appreciate the attempt, and here's why. A lot of Marvel movies are very, very similar, and I mean that in both sometimes a compliment and sometimes a detriment. Shang-Chi, a detriment, for example, more so. Whereas I feel like this actually is trying to do its own thing by doing things that are more closely associated with a more typical vampire movie. I do feel like there is a bit of injection into that, and I actually do appreciate that. As mehly executed it is, I do appreciate at least the attempt of making it almost not feel like a Marvel movie for the most part. You know, if you took away the name, and if it didn't clearly say Marvel right there, honestly, I do think that this could have passed for a vampire movie. A bad or mediocre one at most, but still. Again, I gotta give it that level of credit. It felt like it was trying to be not like every other Marvel movie, or the vast majority of them. You know, I feel like, and this movie even mocks the fact that Venom was like a thing, which is bizarre because, honestly, I think this movie would have worked better if it actually did get that rated R, and if it actually sunk deeper than Venom, and not made the reference to Venom. I think these little things actually would have elevated the movie instead of holding it back into these Marvel shackles that make it feel less genuine that this could have been. Because I do think that this movie could have worked. I do. I think that there's enough content here with Morbius to be more like a, just treat him like a more, like again, it's almost treated like a vampire movie. If they stuck to that from beginning to end and didn't associate any of that Marvel shit, I think this movie would have been successful, honestly. And just did a little bit more with the character work within the continuity of this movie. I feel like if they did those two things, this movie would have been successful. But it's not, unfortunately. So, getting back on track to what the plot is, so he indeed attacks the one of the crew, and the doctor gets knocked out in the process. The rest of the ship gets attacked in a very similar regard, where they barely see him in the shadows, and again, it's shot very much like a horror movie, which again, this is probably the most interesting the movie gets, is right here. So we cut into after we see Morbius lose his power after a certain limit of time. He cripples back into his crippled state again. We cut back to the doctor checking in with Milo very briefly. And as we cut back to Morbius, we see him do like the very superhero type thing we see in various movies, like the first Iron Man, where he's like trying to test out his abilities. So again, taking a lot from earlier movies where he's doing that, so I actually don't mind this part, and he's using, like, he learns that he has an echo location ability. Now, how he gets further abilities, they just kind of come when they need them to later on. But I do appreciate when it's more like, oh, he's actually trying to, like, it's still sort of happening, but it's like, there's a sense of like, oh, he kind of is trying to focus on that aspect, so he's, you know, I don't know. There's definitely a trick in that, style of doing it that I think works a little bit better, even if it's like, oh, you know, a lot of these powers are nonsense or whatever, which I really don't care if they are. But, I mean, he's a vampire. Fuck it. So he recognizes that that he can live off of fake blood for 6 hours at a time without resorting back to what he was before. And thus, Milo bumps into him, and he begs for the cure when he figures out that Morbius has taken it. However, Morbius is trying to help him avoid becoming what he has already become. So, the cops move in, and they check in with our female doctor. And, oh, hold on. I went away from my notes for like a second here. There we go. Just give me a second to find where I was. So, we follow this other female doctor, and I think the placement of this is, I think, poorly put together again, where it's almost insinuated later that this attack was done by the other guy, Milo, but he hadn't taken the thing yet. So I think they actually fucked up in the writing. Like, genuinely, like, they made a plot hole of, like, who was where and who had what at what time. So that one was a pretty big fuck up. But at this point in the time in the movie, Morbius obviously sees the female already had been attacked and think it was him. So the cops check in with Morbius, and they almost bring him in. He overhears, which they, again, we saw the brief setup, so he's able to catch on that they're about to do that. And he runs off, but I guess he's somehow caught, question mark? Because he's moved into a prison right after, so, nah. And of course, they had to take another Marvel property and use it, because they have him say the line right out of the Hulk movie, where he says, "You won't like me when I'm hungry," which is a complete reference to "you won't like me when I'm angry." So this movie is really trying to take advantage of, like, hey, remember the Hulk? Hey, remember Venom? Those were movies. The Hulk, you know, having, like, less success earlier on, and eventually when he became a part of the Avengers, and Venom, whose two movies are like these weird sort of like nonsense like Venom movies that are just like, it's their placement within the Marvel universe is definitely an oddity in it on themselves. So probably not the best two picks of movies to like be like, hey, remember that thing? It's like, yeah, I remember how bad that was, or, you know, how mediocre that was, depending on what you're referring to. So yeah, that happens, and I have to find where I was again. Right. So, we learn now that Milo took the cure, which is, again, how this is shot, it almost seems like he just took the cure now, when, like, after he, after Morbius got arrested, which makes the whole earlier attack just outright confusing if they were trying to imply that Morbius just lost control, or if it was Milo. Because I think Milo says something later on in the movie that indicates that it was him, so I think they completely fucked up. Regardless, there was a fuck up somewhere in this movie in the dialogue. For sure, 100%. It's undeniable. Just where it is located, I'm not entirely sure where it is. It's just a mess. So, Morbius listens in, hearing Milo's attack from his current position, and this little chase begins. Milo attacks the cops on purpose in his more vampiric state, and Morbius goes after, just learning how to fly in that very instance. Now, again, not surprised that he can fly, it's just that the timing of this is very miraculous, as he's, like, just avoiding the train as it's coming in as he's flying out, and, like, there was no, like, training montage along with the Echo location, or, like, attempting to learn how to fly and failing part. So this, like, that an aspect does feel like it was a little bit more like, oh, they're just doing it to move the plot along and have, like, this attempt at a cool shot or something or other. So Milo goes to their old dock, and the Daily Bugle shows the update of, like, these attacks. So Morbius talks with the doc after the fact. During the diner table, after his little scene with the doc, he fakes getting burned with his doctor friend, or aka his significant other, abruptly at the end of the movie, or close to it. So he takes a blood bag from a close EMT and starts to move, following these two suspicious guys who are moving into this little secret facility. This is where he uses the "I'm Venom" line to get them to evacuate the situation. Meanwhile, Milo, feeling all up on himself, dances about, then proceeds to talk with some lady, flirting because he can do it now. The lady has, like, this boyfriend who's, like, a quote-unquote jerk, like, guy who's like, hey, whatever, blah, 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 blah. And he has his friends with him, and they're like, blah, 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 get out of here. And then he listens in, he waits for them all to leave, and proceeds to attack them, mostly off-screen, so, things you could have showed. Anyway, so we see Milo is stopped by the doc, by their previous doctor. And all the while, the female doctor is hanging out with Morbius, and they head to the roof, and this is where they abruptly kiss. Again, their relationship status went from, I feel like they are just working together, to, oh, they're romantic? I don't buy it. I don't buy it for a second. There is no sense of chemistry in this regard. So, the doc, the other doc, the older doc, checks in with Milo, and Milo attacks said doc. And Morbius is worried that he's whittling down on the amount of fake blood that he's able to have on him versus, taking on human blood. and this is where him and Milo fight one another. He uses his already established Echo Pulse abilities. However, he learns another new ability where he's able to, again, it was very briefly established, this one, in a regard where, like, he had the bats around him and they weren't attacking him. But now he's, like, able to, like, move them and, like, tell them where to go. Like, he's the leader of the bats or whatever. So he is able to attack with them. Milo, stabbed by the anti-bat thing that Morbius created in this last few minutes here. Milo, in his final breaths, makes his apology, or, like, attempt to appeal to, like, their old boyhood, and, by the way, like, Milo killed the old doctor after saying, like, how he was like, oh, you are, like, you always treated Morbius like a perfect kid or whatever, even though we didn't see any of that. Because of course we didn't, because, like, the flashback was, like, a few minutes long, so we got to be told this information instead of shown it, which, in that regards, I call bullshit, because, again, just being told something like that this late in the movie, where you could have just easily established it if you gave it more time. So, yeah, that's totally against the film as well. Milo, after he dies, the doctor, the female doctor, who was attacked in the process, by Milo, was earlier given a drop of blood, and then Morbius finally gave in to the human blood from her. We see her awaken as a vampire, or a vampiress if you want to use more feminine words. And that is where, and her awakening is where the movie ends. Of course, with this being a Marvel movie, I'm not even slightly surprised that they tried to stick in a whole credits and after credits sequence where, in this one, we see Vulture, who was not in the previous Marvel movie with the Sinister Six, made up with Morbius after he, like, was let out of jail, he just appeared in the jail. Like, as if that was to say he was destined to be in that jail cell and was let out for whatever reason, but he meets up with Morbius, and somehow Morbius is fascinated with Spider-Man all of a sudden? I don't know, that after credit sequence was utter nonsense. So yeah, that was Morbius in all of its content in terms of the plot. In terms of what I would score the movie, I would definitely lean towards a 4 out of 10, and I would push for a 5, but I would probably stick to a 4 at the end of the day. There's just too much in terms of issues with the pacing in this movie, which in turn creates the bigger issue of the lack of character and character development, which, again, and I keep having to say this, in a lot of horror movies, since this is attempting to lean in that direction at times, a lot of current horror movies fail to do that character development the right amount of justice so many times, and it's present here too, where it's like the lack of character development is hurting this movie significantly so, where, you know, you could have really, if you gave the movie the breath it deserved, you could have made Morbius a really sympathetic anti-hero. And I think that this movie had that potential. I just think it was so rushed that it never had the opportunity to develop the things it needed to develop. The childhood friendship, like, developing what that actually meant. Like, were those words even true? I feel like they would have been better off if, he was sort of like, not that. Just to keep in theme of, like, what they're attempting to go for here. And the relationship between Morbius and the female doctor. Again, their relationship entirely doesn't exist until the end of the film, where they suddenly feel like they just kiss for the sake of there needing to be a relationship. So yeah, it feels like there are connecting threads of, like, it almost feels like this movie wants you to know who Morbius is before seeing the movie, and meaning to say that, to say also, like, the movie makes it feel like, to look at the outside sources and, and bank on you knowing who the character already is. And I feel like that is a failure on any given movie, where it's like, hey, look at what the character was before, and hopefully you'll see what we're trying to achieve here. I feel like you already failed if that's the mindset you have in any given adaptation. If you're like, look at the material first, you already failed. If that is, you failed as a writer. If that is your mindset, if you're like, hey, I want to adapt Spider-Man, but I hope you've seen all the other Spider-Man movies. I mean, that's a poor example because Spider-Man's already been done to death. Morbius, this is his first live-action movie, comparatively to Spider-Man, who's had a bunch, and Batman, who's had a bunch. This is his first movie, and it already feels like, and it feels like again, like they want you to have seen the show of Spider-Man, know every episode Morbius shows up in, know his backstory, know all that stuff from maybe even the comics or something, and be like, attach that. Please attach that to the character so we don't have to do the legwork. We don't have to earn the legwork of this movie. And I feel like that is doing a disservice to your audience if that is the way you want to go about making a character adaptation work. And again, I was looking forward to this because it was out of a lot of the current Marvel shit, because a lot of the current Marvel shit is objectively shit. I feel like this, out of everything I've seen, out of every Marvel product I have seen, I feel like this was trying its hardest to push away from being a Marvel product while still being attached to Marvel, and it still feels like the studios of Marvel / Disney were like, nope, reel it back into that PG-13, reel it back into entering those slots so we don't have to do any of the hard work. It almost feels like that in regards, and I feel like that's ultimately the biggest shame, because again, I feel like if anything, this movie had the potential to be like Joker, like that level of good, or different even, like a more character-studied movie where it's like, this is the type of Joker story we're telling, and it definitely has its inspirations, but it definitely feels like its own movie at the end of the day, and its character is very much, we're very much given every bit of information we are needed to understand what is going on in that movie. Whereas here, we're dealing with, again, a character who people might not recognize as much as, say, a character like Joker. And because of that, again, I feel like you should, as a writer, work harder to make people understand what this character's plights are if you're going to that anti-hero route. And making sure that you're making it crystal clear what is happening and when it's happening and interjecting just enough character work to make it look like, oh, like, I feel bad for this doctor who's, like, intimately involved, with Morbius, and having her be in more pain as she struggles to stay with him as he's going through this transformation. And, even going that route with it, even adding that little detail would have added a significant little, like, oh, like, I'm actually invested because she's invested in him. And it doesn't feel like that's in the movie at all. It just feels like their relationship just happens at the end of the movie, and it happens for the sake of it happening, because they're an item in the show, but there's nothing to establish what their relationship is in the movie. And that's a problem. So, again, I feel like I need to push this to a 3 out of 10, because I feel like, again, you could have done so much more. This movie could have been so much more than just a another shitty Marvel movie, because that is not what Marvel needs right now. Marvel does not need this, comparatively to DC, which has been coming out with hit after hit as of recently. So I'm gonna say it. I think DC is doing a better job at making superhero movies and supervillain movies right now than Marvel is, which, a few years ago that would have been hearsay, but, because Marvel used to be like, oh, the Avengers and all this cool stuff is happening, earlier Avengers stuff, and now it's like, now Marvel's a joke. Now every Marvel movie, I'm just like, well, fuck, if this is the content we're getting for Marvel, I'm still looking forward to what DC's coming up with. I mean, the Batman, for example, yeah, it had its issues. That is not to say that that is the case. It definitely had its issues, but I definitely enjoyed that a lot more than Morbius. I understood a lot more of what was going on in the Batman in terms of a majority of the content, with some mistakes along the way. Even their relationship with the Batman and the Catwoman is like a little bit wonky there. And the Riddler at the end of the movie becomes an absolute joke. But I mean, if there are parts of that movie that are really, really good, that's already leagues above what this is, where it's like, oh, we're moving on to the next horrible part. Oh, we're moving on to the next mediocre part. Oh, we're moving on to the next mediocre part. Oh, we're moving up to the next horrible part. It's just like, you're not letting the movie breathe. You're not letting the movie allow itself to be any good by doing this to itself, by pacing itself that quickly and just rushing through any potential for character development and character work. So, I'm actually going to drop it to a 2 out of 10. I've dropped the score twice in the thought process of thinking about this movie. So I think this movie is really bad, and it being a Marvel movie definitely didn't do it any favors whatsoever. Again, if anything, I think like that held it even further back from being anything close to being good. So I'm going to stick with a 2 out of 10. So I would definitely say this is a skip in that regard. And I think it's a shame. I really do. I think this movie could have been a success. Could have been Marvel's reawakening into like, hey, we're back, bitches. And, as shitty as the majority of Generation 4, or whatever they call it these days, or set up for, or I forget what word it is, whatever 4, Phase is the word, Phase 4, the majority of it shit, with the exception of the main Spider-Man stuff, which is part Marvel, part Sony, so Marvel can't even take full credit for the successful Marvel Spider-Man movies as of recently, the most recent Spider-Man movie. But, I mean, if this is trying to catch up to, like, what Spider-Man's doing, like, yeesh. Both this and Venom have fell victim to that now. And I feel like they're gonna do it again. They're definitely gonna do it again. They're gonna fuck up another villain from Spider-Man before we're done. They're gonna fuck up another one, which is terrible because I feel like they were doing such a really established, good job on the main Spider-Man movies, especially that third one with the trilogy of heroes. Anyways, that is my full review or rant of Morbius. If you ended up enjoying it, then please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, make sure to check out those links in the description. One will head you over into my Discord, second to my Patreon, third to my PayPal. Any donations are greatly appreciated. Until next time, everyone, bye-bye.